Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us. We're here today with our friend Cassidy Hall. Cassidy's an author, award-winning filmmaker, podcaster, ordained minister in the United Church of Christ, and leading voice in contemplative spirituality. She's the co-host of the Encountering Silence podcast and the creator of the Contemplating Now and Queering Contemplation podcasts. Her films include In Pursuit of Silence and Day of a Stranger. Her new book is titled Queering Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. Born and raised in Iowa, Cassidy currently serves as Director of Communications for the Heartland and IKC conferences in the United Church of Christ. Her MTS thesis is titled Awakening Mysticism with the Scholarship of Three African American Women and features the work of the Reverend Dr. Barbara A. Holmes, Spiritual Directors of Color Network founder and friend of ours, Therese Taylor Simpson, and Dr. Joy R. Bostic. Cassidy also served as the secretary of the International Thomas Morton Society and continues to serve on the board. Cassidy co-authored Notes on Silence, and her work has been featured in devotionals in the Christian Century, Convivium Journal, the Thomas Merton Seasonal, the Thomas Merton Annual, Huffington Post, Pathos, and the National Catholic Reporter. She's also worked on the editorial staff of the Wilbur Award-winning blog, Sick Pilgrim. Cassidy currently resides in Indianapolis, where she's studying for her DMin degree. And you can learn more about Cassidy and all her great work at CassidyHall.com. So Cassidy, it's so good to see you. Congratulations on all your work, and thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's so great to be with you, and I just really appreciate the invite. My bio is a little bit of a tongue twister. I realized, when I first came to contemplative spirituality, I had no idea how to even say the word. And then the whole difference between contemplative and contemplate and all those differences, it took me a while to jump into that. So
I,
it's quite a tongue twister.
I can never pronounce contemplative correctly. I always want to say contemplation,
Or yeah, contemplative or like, yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And so I'm assuming I'm saying it correctly
Yeah,
when I say
abs
contemplative, but I always stumble over that.
absolutely. Every way it's said is right to me. I mean, that's one thing that I hope that the book gets across is the accessibility of contemplative spirituality and the ways that we're already doing it. We just don't use that name for it. We don't talk about it in that way.
Yeah, that's what I want to get into in our conversation because, I'm still learning about that whole area. But what else besides, what I kind of gave as a high level bio would you like people to know about you?
Well, what else is there to know? I guess I guess I would say is that I am an avid hiker. I really enjoy hiking. I enjoy getting outside. Today it's raining. I love rainy walks. And I am an avid plants collector. I have a lot of plants right now. So those are some of the things that I'm thinking about. A
Then I
lot of,
guess I guess I should mention too that you're going to be appearing at the Wild Goose Festival this summer,
yes.
which I've enjoyed tremendously. So I'm glad that you're going to be there again too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm excited to be there. Excited to get really hot and sweaty while doing all kinds of learning and, listening and hopefully doing a podcast interview there as well. So,
Good, good, good. Well,
yeah.
it's a wonderful event. I'll miss it this year, but I'm really glad that you're going to be able to go.
Thanks.
So there are a couple different areas that we'd like to discuss today. First, let's talk about your new book. As I mentioned, the title is Queering Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. So how did that book come about?
Wow, how did that book come about? You know what? So you also mentioned my MTS thesis, my Master's of Theological Studies thesis, which was Awakening Mysticism with the scholarship of three African American women. And once I graduated with my MDiv and my MTS, I wanted to write something, but I didn't quite know what it was. So I was kind of adapting my MTS thesis towards a possible book. And ultimately, somebody gave me the time of day to say, you know what? You shouldn't write this. You're a white woman.
Ah,
And where's your story? Where are you?
hmm,
There's none of you in this. And so I sat on that for quite some time, kind of pondering, what is my voice in this world? What is my voice in, you know, studies of mysticism or contemplative spirituality and these kinds of things? And so one of the things I recognized that I potentially had to bring to the conversation that I wasn't hearing very much of, I was hearing some of, but not very much of, was the intersection of LGBTQ folks and contemplative life.
hmm,
So after that, I kind of went down a totally different direction and worked on a book proposal that focused more on my own voice, my own stories, my own experiences of the ways that contemplative life has awakened my queerness, how queerness has awakened my contemplative life, and the ways those two things feel so similar to me in
hmm,
my identity.
hmm. That's very cool. And I mean, I think what you've come up with is something very interesting. As we were talking beforehand, I love books where I'm learning something. So, some of the questions that I'm going to ask are probably a little bit naive and maybe silly for some folks, but I'm just trying to learn, and so
Absolutely.
one example is the title. Um,
Yeah.
I've always thought of queer as an adjective, but you're using it as a verb, or using the verb form of the word.
Yeah.
So can you explain to folks what you mean by queering?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, first of all, also there's no silly or naive questions or thoughts,
I have
We're
plenty
just
of them,
we're
but
friends chatting. Um, so I think first I want to name the fact that the etymological roots of the word queer go back, I'm trying to remember what century. I'll tell you for sure once I look it up, but I want to say it's like the 14th or 15th century, not totally positive, in Scots, language primarily of Scotland. And it wasn't until the late 19th century when the word began to reference homosexuals or
Hmm,
homosexuality. But prior to that, and so really for most of the life of the word, it actually meant odd or strange or oblique.
hmm,
These kinds of like weird, odd, strange. And so moving the words, when I move the words towards queering, when I think about queering something, I'm thinking about it in a way of looking at things differently. So looking at things through a lens of oddity, through a lens of strangeness, through a lens of obliqueness, through a lens of curiosity. In the book, I say that queer is not just related to my sexuality, but it's also the way I tilt my head to look at the world. And the Reverend Dr. Pamela Lightsey, who wrote Our Lives Matter, A Queer Womanist Theology, she says that to say that I am queer is not only my self-identity, but it is my active engagement against heteronormativity. So when we queer something, we're actively engaging against dominative forces. We're actively engaging against the forces of patriarchy, heteronormativity, capitalism, anything that is antithetical to the justice and liberation of all people. So when I say queer in contemplation, I'm saying, we're looking at it differently. We're looking at it with our heads tilted. We're stripping it from the grasp of dominative forces. Um, yeah, I don't know if that's helpful.
yeah, yeah. No,
Okay,
that comes across in your book. I mean,
good,
in terms of
good,
how you're approaching this, it seems to me anyway.
good.
Um, but even the word contemplation then too, I initially, I guess when I first started coming into experiencing more of the, spiritual publishing arena, I thought of contemplation more as meditation.
Yeah.
And, but, from reading your book and talking to other people and other things, to me now it seems more something like what Frederick Buechner would call paying attention.
Mm,
Contemplation of meaning paying attention to your inner world and your outer world too. And then the queering contemplation is something like open-mindedness.
mm,
As you said, viewing the world from a less than traditional perspective, maybe, or whatever.
Hmm.
But I'm not sure if I'm, using all those words correctly or not. How do you think of that?
Yeah, I think, if I had to funnel down what contemplation is to me into the most concise form, I think I would just simply name it as the sacred pause or a sacred pause. And the reason I would define it like that is because everyone's going to define what sacred is differently for themselves. Everyone's going to define what a pause is differently for themselves. And I like what you said about paying attention, right? Simone Weil says that absolute unmixed attention is prayer.
Hmm.
And so I think in that way, thinking about both of those things, contemplation can be prayer, contemplation can be meditation. Contemplation can be me looking at this tree outside my window. Contemplation can be the deep sigh of relief a parent takes when they finally have a moment, folding laundry away from their screaming children. Contemplation is things that we're always doing throughout our day that bring us back to that sacred center, that bring us back to that sacred pause,
Hmm.
that that stillness, that solitude, that peace within. And again, it might only be a second sometimes, and sometimes it's a 20-minute intentional sit, and sometimes it's a weekend retreat. Or I just think it's so important and so crucial to recognize the times that we are already doing it, because another thing about contemplative spirituality that I've found is there tends to be this deep encouragement of having a practice and a rhythm. And I'm all for that. And I think that's important. And I think for me, that's been very, very helpful. And it can be really, really discouraging for people who don't yet have a practice or who don't know where to begin. And I think the best place to begin is to always recognize that we're already doing it.
That, honestly speaking, that's really helpful for me. The whole idea of sacred pause, because I'm not good at meditation or anything like that at all. My
Sure.
attention span is, a nanosecond.
Yeah.
And, my whole life has been go, 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 go. And I kind of honestly feed off of, and thrive on a lot of activity and keeping busy and being busy and juggling 27 things at once. I don't like Sabbath or, in some of,
Yeah.
the more, traditional ways of thinking of it. But yet, many of my really good friends do, right? And I respect that highly. But this
Yeah.
whole idea of a sacred pause, I can see that in my life all over the place,
Yeah. Yeah.
but quite honestly.
Yeah. I mean, noticing the dewdrops on a leaf in a morning walk, making sure we pause to see the butterfly fluttering by. I mean, these sacred pauses can happen all the time, and you're already doing them.
Yeah, yeah.
You
No,
know?
thank you for that analogy. I love that phrase. That's very helpful.
Good, good.
So in the book, you mentioned a conversation with an editor at an unnamed publishing house as saying that their company would probably view LGBTQ voices as more liability than asset. And as you know, I've worked with lots of different publishing houses in the Christian space through my Writing for Your Life and Publishing in Color conferences, and I've heard or experienced, similar kinds of things.
Yeah.
Um, so I view, not wanting to publish LGBTQ voices as another form of discrimination, just like not wanting to publish authors of color.
Right.
And over, recent years, it seems like publishing houses are more willing, in some cases anxious, to publish voices of color. But do you think that they've shifted the needle much in terms of publishing, the LGBTQ voices?
I would say yes, and I would say yes, and there's always more that can be done. I mean, there's always more to do, to share. I do think that some publishing houses, maybe also especially in religion, tend to, once they start sharing these voices from the margins, they tend to um, do so in a safe way. They're not they're not necessarily going as bold as I would like to see them go. And I think that, another thing that I think about a lot is the idea that a lot of these books, and I think this is necessary to a degree, a lot of these books are related to that identity rather than the wisdom of the person.
Mhm.
So I think I don't know that we can say we've quote unquote made it until we have a combination of a larger amount of the wisdom from people from all different experiences, um, alongside the relationship of their identity related to their wisdom. And I think that,
Sure.
does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Know what you mean about, safe, quote unquote, publishing. You know,
Yeah.
um, and there's a spectrum within Christian publishers, right? I mean, your book is published by Broadleaf Books, right? Which I have a great amount of respect for, and my humble opinion has done a lot in terms of publishing marginalized voices,
Yeah.
across a variety of types. There are plenty of other Christian publishing houses who have not.
Hmm.
And in cases where, sometimes they do publish, a person of color, it may be, a safe version, as you're saying, as opposed to more controversial, or at least in their neck of the woods.
Well, yeah, well, I think by safe, what do I mean by safe in particular? I think I really want to see authors feel totally free. And I can only speak from my experience, so I don't know the experience of a person of color in publishing. Um, but from my experience, I felt very free to express um, all kinds of things. I mean, I talk about eroticism in the book. I talk about falling in love with a tree. I talk about um, pleasure and play and all kinds of things. And I think that I felt fairly unrestricted. I think and I didn't have any restrictions put upon me. And I think that um, one of the things I think I'd like to see in Christian publishing is just more, just, yeah, just more like ways to learn and to grow in these ways and to hear from the marginalized um, from a perspective that's not even hindered by religion or um, expectation or um, I think some of my favorite Christian books, relate to intersectional marginalized identity. So whether it's the, queer person of color um, or the, you know, disabled immigrant or, these kinds of intersections of identity, of marginalization, I find really, really, really helpful because I think there are so many voices that have been missing from the table of Christian publishing that we've got a lot of work to do to get them all at the table. And it's going to take a while. It's going to take a while, and it's going to take a pretty big, shift to elevate these voices in order to equalize their truth, to equalize their brilliance, to equalize, um, you know, all the wisdom that is there that we've been missing for so, so, so many years.
Well, that's where I find I learn the most is from people like that,
Yeah,
that share a background and experience that I don't have. So it's
yeah,
I'm glad to see people publishers like Broadleaf doing more of that.
yeah.
So another interesting comment that you made in the book is this one. You say, I believe it's finally time to acknowledge that my long obsession with the words and wisdom of Thomas Merton and other status quo contemplatives crowded out other voices and perspectives, other roots of depth, preventing me from hearing them fully, starting with my own. So there's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with what brought you to that conclusion.
Yeah, you know what brought me to that conclusion was when I was working on my theological studies thesis, I was learning so much from Black women on the topic of mysticism, um, specifically as it relates to embodied mysticism, which Dr. Joy Bostick talks a lot about, as it relates to the action necessary related to mysticism, which Therese Taylor Stinson speaks a lot to, as it relates to public mysticism, which Dr. Barbara Holmes speaks to. And all of these voices, were fairly new to me. I had come to them mostly, I think, in seminary, but this wisdom has been just not at the top of the pile, so to speak, because by the nature of publishing and by the nature of um, you know, the status quo, wanting to keep the status quo, Thomas Merton's books have been atop this pile, or Bernard McGinn's books have been atop this pile, or Rufus Jones's books have been atop this pile. Um, Largely cisgender straight white men. Um, and so I just recognized, and I dedicated myself. I had a turning point moment in seminary when I took a James Cone class.
Hmm.
And I believe it was Black Theology and Black Power was the book that just radically shifted things for me. After I read that book, I had this kind of like internal commitment to never write another paper without a voice of color, to and for the primary amount of resources to be people of color, or people of marginalized experiences. And then also just recognizing how quick I was to go to these status quo voices,
Hmm.
um, who, I mean, many of the voices we still go to, they're not even here. How can they speak to our lifetime? How can they speak to our experiences? Um, so that was kind of a journey to get to that place where, you know, also, as much as I love the words and the insights and the wisdom of Thomas Merton, he also had some problematic things that he said. For instance, um, there's a letter he wrote to an unknown friend, is how it's written. And in that letter, he's responding to someone asking questions about homosexuality. And in that letter, he says something to the effect of perhaps psychiatric help would be of use.
Hmm.
And these are the kinds of words that have, harmed queer folks for forever. And to hold the wisdom of folks alongside some of these things that are problematic. I mean, I think we need to recognize that, and I think we need to see that. Um, and I think we also need to recognize, okay, maybe there's other voices that can speak to this in a better way, in a way related to my time, in a way related to my truth of innate belonging as a queer person. So that was also kind of a shift for me to to really let go of the status quo and to recognize um, the ways that I've been honestly lazy in scholarship.
Hmm.
And I think that that's one of the big things is that the marginalized voices are there. They've been there. They've been writing. They've been speaking. But by the nature of, again, you know, greater access to publishing for, um, folks that are, in a dominative groups, unfortunately, those books are more accessible. I mean, literally, they cost less. Some of the books I was using for my thesis, I remember one was $70.
Hmm.
And it's a brilliant book. It's a wonderful book. But by the nature of it just being so difficult to find because so few were printed,
Hmm.
um, you know, and that's not going to change until we start buying those books, until we start really heeding those voices and listening to that wisdom, in all realms, not just in everyday Christian reading or spiritual reading, but also in our scholarship and in the ways we choose to study.
So how did this realization allow you to, as you said, unblock your own views?
Unblock my own what?
Views. Your own expressions.
Yeah. Um, because I came to contemplative spirituality predominantly through these voices, Thomas Merton, Henry Nouwen, Richard Rohr, even Cynthia Bourgeois or um, Jim Finley. Um, I didn't even know the context or what it would mean or look like, or if there was anything different or important about my queerness as a contemplative, because none of the voices I had listened to ever spoke to that. So I think that made me recognize, okay, this is an aspect of identity that I'm experiencing as missing from the conversation of the people that I've been reading and heeding. And yeah, and that kind of helps me to recognize, okay, maybe there's something I can bring to the conversation. Um, and then the book happened.
Good, good. So, what would you like for people to most take away from the book?
Yeah, I love that question, Brian, because I think it goes back to the beginning of this conversation and the accessibility of contemplation and the accessibility of contemplation as not only something that we're already doing, but something that we're already doing with that tinge of queerness. Because I think contemplative life is innately queer. I think contemplative life is innately odd and strange and unique and wonderful and weird because we have monastics who live in the monastery for their entire lives. Contemplatives take time to intentionally be still, intentionally have sacred pauses. There's so many ways in which contemplative life is beautifully weird. And I think it really invites us into something that deeply tethers us to the divine.
Hmm. So, if we could, I'd like to shift gears a little bit and
Okay.
talk about finding your next calling. Um, so, you've worn several different hats. What would you say is your process you found best for discernment of, what to do next, which path to go down?
Yeah. Um, I've had some pretty odd um, shifts in my life. And, um, in 2011, 2010 through 2012, I think I was working as a counselor in Iowa. And I was working at a community agency. I was really burnt out. I was overworked and underpaid, all the things, right? Paperwork piled up. Um, and I was new to the field, and so naturally I was given extra work and those kinds of things. Um, and I started having panic attacks at that job.
Hmm.
And that was a really big turning point for me. And that is when I started to read Thomas Merton's New Seeds of Contemplation.
Hmm.
And I was reading it in between clients and forgoing my paperwork. And um, and that's a big shift that led me to change something. And ultimately that led to me traveling to Gethsemane Abbey in Kentucky, falling in love with the silence there, coming back to my job, putting in my 30-day notice, and traveling to all 17 Trappist monasteries.
Wow.
And I will never forget, that was about a 6-month period. And I will never forget that the only thing I knew for those 6 months was that I didn't know what I was doing, but I knew I was supposed to be doing it.
Wow.
And I remember moments on this trip where I would kind of just feel like, Cassidy, what are you doing with your life? You're spending your savings, you're traveling to monasteries, you don't want to be a monk or a nun. What are you doing? And I just kept hearing, like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I'm supposed to be doing it. Um, and sure enough, I just kept following that sense of knowing. That sense of knowing. It's like when you step towards something and you don't know where your foot's going to land, but you know you have to take the next step. And I knew that was a particular direction of a step I needed to take. I needed to pivot out of that job and take that next step. And ultimately that led to me working in documentary filmmaking in Los Angeles,
Hmm.
working with someone who was working on a documentary about silence, In Pursuit of Silence was the film we did together. And yeah, and just I kept listening to that voice. Even when I came here for seminary in 2018, I said, okay, I'm going to give this a try. Don't know what I'm doing, but I, I know I'm supposed to be here. This all feels right. And so really listening to that internal instinctual voice. And I think that for women in particular, um, that's something we're often told not to listen to.
Hmm.
And for me, that's been spirit. That's been um, my connection to spirit, my connection to spirit's voice and embodiment and the ways, we feel about choices, the ways we feel about things. What in our body is the hearty yes. Um, what in our body is the maybe, but let's try. And kind of listening to those internal voices.
So, what advice do you have for other people who maybe aren't as far along on their journey toward, being a solo entrepreneur?
Well, let me tell you, I haven't quit the day job, The day job is necessary and I think in particular for creative people, it's so important to have the work that you do in the world. Um, I'm lucky I do work that's meaningful to me. It's, at the conference level for my denomination. And I was ordained in that position as their digital minister. And, I think one really important thing for creatives to have in that dynamic is find flexibility because we all know when the creativity strikes, it is never a convenient time. It's us in the middle of a meeting and we need to get out our, notes app or jot down, some phrase that came to our head that, could mean something in 3 weeks or might mean nothing. But those moments we have to keep capturing because capturing those moments, capturing those phrases is a lot of what keeps that part of us alive, that part of us afloat. And maybe for the musician, it's, you know, something that they hear, tune they hear in their head that they need to write down or hum in their notes app or something. So, yeah.
Cool, cool. So, I realize you're in the midst of a major book launch, and we all know how much time and energy that takes. But is there anything you can talk about in terms of the future? Um, Whether it's, books or anything else that you have thought about or you're ready to talk about?
Yeah, I could share a little bit about I started working on my dissertation for my doctorate, and that's going to focus on queering mysticism
Hmm.
and the innate weirdness of mysticism, Um, from the ways mystics have fallen in love with trees and nature to the ways that the mystics have really had a lot of erotic imagery with the divine, like St. John of the Cross, and kind of so addressing the mystics of old alongside hearing voices from queer mystics today and kind of putting those in conversation with each other um, is what I'm working on right now. Yeah.
Interesting, interesting. Well, we'll look forward to learning more about that when the time is right.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Well, Cassidy, thanks so much, for spending some time with us. It's really great to do that and to see you again and spend some time. And congratulations on your new book and all of your important work. Um, Again, the title of Cassidy's new book is Queering Contemplation, Finding Queerness in the Roots and Future of Contemplative Spirituality. And go check out more about Cassidy at CassidyHall.com. So Cassidy, again, thanks so much, and best wishes with the book and all the other work.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be with you.